That night seemed ordinary. A family dinner, a full table, laughter drowning out the clatter of silverware. But I knew it was no ordinary night. There was something in the air, like a silent storm about to break. Andrew, my husband of 7 years, raised his glass and, with his spoon, got everyone's attention. "I have an announcement to make," he said in a voice that tried to sound firm, but to me it sounded shaky and hesitant. I noticed the slight tremor in his hand, the way he looked away from me and met the eyes of my sister, Jenna, sitting across the table. My heart raced, not out of surprise, but because I already knew. For months I had been carrying the weight of this secret that they believed was theirs alone. Then Andrew took a deep breath and said, "Vivian and I are getting a divorce." A shocked whisper ran through the room. My mother gasped, Aunt Patricia put her hand to her chest, and my father frowned in confusion. But Andrew wasn't finished. As if that wasn't enough, he reached out to Jenna and added, "Jenna and I fell in love. We fight it, but sometimes love chooses for us." That was the exact moment when everyone, without exception, turned their eyes to me, expecting to see my world fall apart right there. They expected tears, screams, dishes flying across the room. That was what they expected from the betrayed woman. But what they saw was different. I just took a deep breath and, with the calm of someone who has weathered many storms, said, "Please check your emails." Andrew blinked, confused. "What emails?" "I sent them before dinner," I replied calmly, taking out my own cell phone. That was the time for them to find out what I already knew, and what I had carefully prepared. This wasn't just a marital betrayal. It was a story of lies, manipulation, and secrets whispered in secret. And every detail, every step they took in the shadows, was there in the attachments that had just arrived in everyone's inboxes at the table. I wasn't just the betrayed wife. I was the digital forensics expert they'd underestimated. I was the storm they hadn't seen coming. Around the table, the sound of silverware clinking stopped as if time had stopped. One by one, members of my family, still reeling from Andrew's announcement, reached for their phones. The first to react was my cousin David, who opened the email and his eyes widened as if he'd seen a ghost. He scrolled quickly, trying to absorb the content I'd carefully prepared. His expression was a mix of disbelief and outrage. My mother, right behind me, clapped her hand over her mouth, trying to stifle a second gasp that night, only this time it wasn't surprise, it was pure disappointment. The tension was palpable. "What did you do?" Jenna hissed through chattering teeth, her face paling as her fingers shook as she unlocked her phone. Beside her, Andrew looked increasingly uncomfortable, unable to open his own email, as if he feared what he would find there. I kept my composure. "Whatever it is, it's just documentation," I said, my voice as steady as stone. "Something I'm particularly good at." And then it happened. Like a domino effect, faces around the table began to change. The initial surprise dissolved into something deeper, more cutting: disapproval, anger, a quiet indignation that wasn't directed at me, but at Andrew and Jenna. They hadn't realized it yet, but they were completely exposed. What my family read there was just the tip of the iceberg. I had compiled every detail, every piece of evidence, every trace of betrayal, and what they had in their hands was only a fraction of the truth. The bitter irony was that Andrew and I's story began in a setting of generosity. Fate had brought us together at a fundraiser for Seattle Children's Hospital. He was a dedicated pediatric anesthesiologist, someone who conveyed compassion even in his eyes. Little did I know, representing my cybersecurity company, that I would meet the man I would share my life with there. Our love seemed like a coincidence, or fate. Within a year, we were married, sealing our promise of love in my parents' backyard. The first few years were a perfect picture. We bought a bungalow in Queen Anne, and each weekend renovation felt like building, brick by brick, the home of our dreams. Andrew, despite his long hours at the hospital, always made time for us. Elaborate breakfasts on Sundays, notes hidden in my work bag, last-minute escapes just to watch the sunset together. I had never felt so loved, so safe. Jenna, my youngest sister, had always been the restless spirit of the family. She had dropped out of college twice, moved cities, jobs, dreams, and when she returned to Seattle after yet another failure in Denver, I was the one who took her in. I was the one who suggested she move in with us. Andrew hesitated. Are you sure? This could change our dynamic. But I persisted. Family helps family. The plan was for her to stay for 2 months, until she got settled. It turned into 6. She found a job at an art gallery and claimed that Seattle rents were out of reach. I didn't care. I had always wanted my sister around. Her presence seemed to fill an invisible space in the house and even in me. But looking back, I see the signs I ignored. The lingering glances, the conversations that were too low, the laughter that seemed a little too intimate. And I, with all the love and trust of a devoted sister and wife, was blind. But now, no one was blind anymore. And they, Andrew and Jenna, were about to discover that the worst was yet to come. The days that followed felt like a cruel staging of a play whose script I didn't know, but whose dialogue I already knew by heart. Andrew's every gesture, every smile, every tender touch now carried an unbearable weight. It was as if I had been cast into a shadow theater, where every familiar movement hid a dark secret behind the curtain. I watched him in silence. The way he made coffee as always, the way he kissed me goodnight on the forehead, the same kiss that, months before, I would have considered a gesture of pure love, now seemed almost rehearsed, an empty routine masking a farce. And Jenna. Jenna continued to frequent our house as if nothing were happening. At Sunday dinners, her laughter filled the room, so light and carefree that it could fool anyone, except me. I already knew. And knowing was like carrying an invisible thorn under my skin, piercing with every slightest movement. My mind, trained to trace patterns, now ran wild, revisiting moments from the past like a detective goes through old files. The quick messages that Andrew kept hidden. The looks he and Jenna exchanged when they thought no one was looking. The last-minute changes of plans. The absences disguised as extended shifts. They were all there, clear signs in retrospect, like scattered clues that I, blinded by trust, refused to see. I asked myself, night after night, where I went wrong. Was loving too much a mistake? Was trusting foolish? The answer never came. But the certainty that I needed to do something grew stronger. If I am an expert at anything, it is tracking down hidden truths. It was ironic, my profession consisted of finding traces invisible to the unwary eye, and yet, in my own home, I had been the last to see them. But now, I saw. I saw everything. What Andrew and Jenna didn't know was that, while they were still acting, I was already 2 steps ahead. Every conversation recorded, every routine movement, every email file carefully retrieved and organized. I was no longer the naive wife who laughed at Heather's theories. I was Vivian Hayes, the digital forensics analyst. And this time, my investigation wasn't a contract. It was personal. In those days of silent vigil, between tears stifled on the pillow and cold coffees in the early hours of the morning, I outlined the outline of my next move. The collapse would not come in the form of screams, nor in dramatic scenes. No. It would be methodical, controlled, definitive. And the truth? The truth, when revealed, would carry the weight of a sentence. Little did they know, the game had already changed. His words cut more than any open confession would have. Not because of their coldness, but because of the familiarity with which he pronounced them. He did not hesitate, did not stutter. He was practiced, as if he had rehearsed this defense countless times in his mind, foreseeing that the day would come. I just smiled slightly and gave a small nod. Of course, it must be all in my head, I murmured, allowing him to think, for a moment, that he had regained control of the situation. Andrew did not realize it, but in that moment, by denying it so blatantly, he sealed his own fate. The subtle recognition I saw in her eyes before they closed again told me more than any words could. In the days that followed, I assumed my role as a devoted wife with an almost artistic precision. I prepared our favorite dinners, we went out with friends, we visited my parents. Everything was perfectly staged. Andrew seemed to gradually relax, believing he had dispelled any suspicion. Jenna, in turn, acted more cautiously. The glances she had previously shot Andrew were now more measured, but still present. What they ignored was that I had already become something neither of them could face, someone who knew too much and, more importantly, someone who would wait for the exact moment to act. While Andrew drowned in excuses for being on call, and Jenna disguised her increasingly constant presence in our routine, I completed my collection. Location records, bank transactions, call logs, screenshots, audios, photos, even deleted messages, nothing escaped. The net was complete. But the most painful thing wasn't seeing how deep the betrayal went. It was realizing how comfortable they were keeping me in the dark. How they had plans, dreams, intimate conversations, and jokes that never included me. As if I were just an obstacle to be eventually removed. And yet, I kept going. Calmly. Without deviating from the routine. At that point, it wasn't just about proving that they were cheating on me, it was about how I was going to do it. I wasn't going to let the ending of this story be another scene controlled by them. No. I would be the one to write the final act. And I already knew exactly where, how, and when. The investigator, Mr. Collins, was discreet, professional, and most importantly, he had handled similar cases before. In his small office, surrounded by folders and corkboards filled with notes, he listened to my story without interrupting. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "I can help you," he said with the calm of someone who had seen this kind of betrayal many times before. Over the next few weeks, Collins worked tirelessly, providing me with evidence I hadn't even imagined. Andrew and Jenna were even more careless than I'd thought. Photographs, audio recordings, detailed bank records, all documented with surgical precision. I discovered that they were already planning not only to move in together, but to sell the house I lived in, without my knowledge, and split the proceeds. Their financial betrayal was the final straw. They weren't just destroying my marriage, they were plotting to erase me from my own life. What Andrew and Jenna didn't know was that while I was appearing to give in, I was actually carefully setting the stage for the final blow. I didn't just want to expose them, I wanted to make sure they felt the weight of every choice they'd made, that every false word, every furtive glance, every plan made behind my back had a consequence. I decided that their anniversary would be the perfect time. The surprise party they were planning would actually be my surprise for them. In the days leading up to the event, I maintained my impeccable posture. I smiled, hugged, thanked Jenna for every effort she made, and participated in the rehearsals for the special night. Mom, unaware of anything, was overjoyed by the dedication of the two to the celebration. And I, with every detail prepared, waited patiently. When the night arrived, with the house full of family and friends, everything seemed perfect. Balloons, soft lights, music, laughter. Andrew and Jenna took turns among the guests, looking like the hosts they were not, while I circulated with my glass of wine and a smile as convincing as theirs. But what they didn't know was that, like all the guests, they would soon be the audience for the real celebration. I was about to end the farce once and for all. On Sunday, the stage was set. The sun filtered softly through the kitchen window, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the house. The family members were gathering around, all anticipating lunch, while Andrew and Jenna performed their perfect couple act. They smiled, exchanged glances, and tried to stay in the safe zone where they could still control the narrative. Andrew greeted me with a kiss on the cheek, and I responded with a smile that didn't reach my eyes. He seemed comfortable, maybe even relieved, unaware that he was just minutes away from a devastating blow. Jenna, with her practiced smile and careful gestures, watched me with that same strange intensity as always. She didn't know that while she was preparing for the show, I was already far beyond any play she or Andrew could ever stage. We all sat at the dinner table, exchanging small talk while my mother brought out the dishes. It was happening, but I still kept my cool. My phone vibrated in my bag, the confirmation I had been waiting for. All the emails had been sent. Each of the recipients now had their own version of the truth, carefully tailored to their perceptions and weaknesses. My father, mother, aunts, and even my cousins were ready to see what was really going on. Their lie was about to be exposed, and there was no turning back now. During the main course, Andrew talked about the trip he and Jenna were planning for next month. He was so engaged in the conversation, so relaxed, that it seemed impossible that reality was about to crash down around him. I knew it was time. I stood up and, with a frozen smile on my face, excused myself. I need to check something quickly. I'll just check my message. I walked back into the kitchen, closed the door behind me, and, with my hands still steady, opened my laptop. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times, and now it was about to happen. With a barely perceptible sigh, I opened the master email, the one that contained all the evidence they had ever thought I would have. The PDF was clear, concise, with every detail meticulously presented. Whatever had held their lie together for so long was about to be dismantled. All the emails, the bank records, the cruel messages, nothing was secret anymore. I took one last look at my reflection, a grim expression on my face. I was ready. I knew exactly what I was doing and who I was doing it to. When I returned to the table, they were laughing at something Andrew had said, but the sound seemed muffled, as if a curtain had fallen between us. They didn't know it, but the game was about to change direction. The truth was coming, and neither of them could control what came next. With the calm of someone no longer trying to hold back a storm, I said, in a low but firm voice, "We have something to discuss." The silence fell like a sharp blade. Andrew and Jenna's masks began to crumble. The tension was in the air, and I could feel Andrew's palms sweating slightly as he struggled to maintain the facade of an emotionally guilty and remorseful man. Jenna, beside him, looked more confident than ever, with a slight smile, as if she already knew that the control of the situation was in her hands. But that smile was about to disappear from their faces. The silence in the room was broken by the sound of cell phones ringing in unison, reality beginning to seep into the minds of those who had been so easily manipulated. Each of my family members opened the email, and I saw their expressions change as the words began to sink in. My parents, my aunts, my cousins, they were all beginning to realize the extent of the betrayal that had unfolded before them. The documents were there, the truth as clear as daylight, and there was no way for Andrew or Jenna to rewrite the narrative. They could no longer control what was real. The first to break the silence was my father. His gaze shifted from his phone to me, then back to Andrew and Jenna. He looked dazed, the weight of the evidence overwhelming his mind as he processed the betrayal that had unfolded before his eyes. Andrew's hand was still in Jenna's, but she no longer looked as sure as she had before. I didn't know," my father murmured, his voice low but full of pain. The anguish in his tone was unmistakable, and I knew the shock was only just beginning. My mother spoke next, her voice shaky but steady, as if she were trying to process what she had just learned. You knew everything, Andrew?" The simple question cut through the air like a sharp knife. She looked at me, her eyes full of regret, and in her gaze, I could see the doubt that had planted in her beliefs, as if she had been an unwitting accomplice. Andrew didn't answer right away. He was at a loss, trying to muster up something to say, but the words escaped him, leaving a void in their place. Jenna, on the other hand, kept her smile, but it no longer had the brightness it once had. It was a nervous smile, trying to hold on, but failing. "You knew all of this?" my aunt asked, her voice cracking with disbelief. The question hung in the air, filled with suspicion and frustration. I remained calm, watching everything unfold. The pain I had felt, the sleepless nights, the moments of despair, they all seemed small now in the face of the force with which the truth was being revealed. Andrew and Jenna were beginning to realize that the charade was over, and there was no escape. "Yes," I said, my voice firm and clear. "I knew it. And now you all know it, too." The looks on Andrew and Jenna's faces were filled with despair and anger, but also with a certain helplessness. They had tried to construct an alternate reality, and I had simply destroyed it, effortlessly. Their power play was over, and I had turned the tables. As the room filled with murmurs and exchanges of incredulous glances, my grandmother, who had been quiet until that moment, slowly stood up and placed her hand on my shoulder. The talisman she had left me seemed more meaningful than ever. I had come this far not only with evidence, but with the strength of all those who had supported me, even if silently. My grandmother, in her wisdom, had always told me that the truth has the power to set people free. And I was about to set everyone free from the lie they had been living. The confrontation was just beginning, but I knew I would not turn back. I was no longer willing to be the betrayed wife who cowered in the shadows. I was taking control, and from that moment on, everything would be different. The room was in a state of profound shock as the words and the truth finally took shape. Andrew and Jenna's carefully orchestrated narrative was crumbling before everyone's eyes. It was no longer a story of lovers who had fallen into a forbidden relationship, but the cruel reality of a systematic deception, planned and executed with calculation. There was no longer room for excuses or false explanations. The truth was naked, merciless, and unstoppable. My family's reaction was immediate and intense. Their looks were a mix of confusion, anger, and shame. My mother, always the pillar of our family, looked at Jenna with a pain I never imagined she would see on her face. It was as if she were seeing not just her daughter's sister, but a stranger who had manipulated her and her family's trust. Her voice, normally soft and welcoming, broke as she asked everyone's question, "How could you do this?" The pain in her voice was the pain of a mother who believed she knew her daughter and was now faced with the truth of her actions. Andrew was trying desperately to maintain control of the situation, but there was no hiding the charade anymore. The clinical tone he tried to adopt, as if he were in a doctor's office, was nothing more than a futile effort to manipulate the emotions and perceptions of others. But what he couldn't understand was that in that moment, he no longer had control over anything. He was no longer dealing with an easily deflected confrontation. He was dealing with the unforgiving truth and a woman willing to expose it. As their exchange unfolded, it became clear that this was not a story of desperate, unexpected love. It was not a sweeping passion that had taken them by surprise, as they had tried to paint it. It was a carefully planned plot that had been going on for years, and now it was being revealed to everyone. David, with characteristic candor, threw the final stone in Andrew's attempted defense, pointing out that they had started planning this whole thing long before. The lie was falling apart, and there was no turning back. But unlike a physical, dramatic confrontation, the real power lay in the way the truth spread among everyone. The evidence I had been gathering for months was now impossible to ignore. Every document, every receipt, every message, and every transaction was there, not as pieces of an emotional puzzle, but as the pure, unquestionable truth. No lie could overcome the facts. When I finally stood up, with a simple, "I must go," the weight of what had happened washed over me like a cold but liberating breeze. The fight was won, but the real impact was not revenge or victory over them. It was clarity, the feeling that I had finally taken control, that the pain and suffering had been transformed into something concrete, something that would not be easily erased. The divorce, though inevitable, was not a triumph of anger or revenge, but a process of rebuilding my own life. Each step I took brought me closer to myself, away from the pain, away from the lies. When my lawyer asked me if I was satisfied with the outcome, I knew that satisfaction was not the goal. The feeling I felt was one of clarity, the knowledge that I had done what needed to be done, with dignity and based on something real. Moving into my new apartment, with its view of Puget Sound, I felt like a new page was being turned, not only in my life, but also in my sense of who I am. I had been through a long process of destruction, but now I was ready to rebuild. The sunset over the water symbolized the closing of one cycle and the opening of another. I had documented, with the same precision and care I always applied to my work, the breakdown of my marriage. But now the truth I had sought was with me, and that was all I needed to move forward.